Lecture number 6 in our handout, Church History, the 5th century in the East, two natures of Christ in one divine person. 1. The theological battle did not end at Nicaea or even at Constantinople, though the standard of a divine Christ was raised for all of subsequent church history. It makes me very happy to say that that particular era, but especially Nicaea, has never been forgotten. And though there's been a great deal of defection, as we've indicated, it's almost as if the whole world recognizes that the essential heart of the Christian religion is the person of Jesus Christ as a divine being. And that, I think, is largely traceable to the fact that Nicaea, under Constantine, made that great affirmation from which the church has never officially departed. And that's the whole church, too. This is an era before we really had denominations, or at least when there was a kind of unity among us that doesn't obtain in later centuries, that even when it did come to this diversedness in later periods, we never forget the basic unity with which the Christian church and church history actually started, with a clear affirmation after much controversy and upheaval of the full deity of Jesus Christ. Now, number 2, granted that Jesus Christ was God, what was the church to make of his humanity? It's almost an embarrassment, you see. One would think that having affirmed so classically that Jesus Christ is God, he would at the same time be excluding any notion of a creature. Arius was shown to be in profound error by saying that Christ was a creature, referring to the sonship of Jesus. The Son of God was no creature. And of course, Arius was wrong in suggesting it, because as God, Jesus Christ was as eternal as the Father. If he was begotten at all, it was an eternal begottenness. He was not a catesis. He was not a creature. And as I say, the whole 4th century was mostly involved with that great affirmation. And you could see how many people would then say, what in the world are we going to do with the humanity? Humanity is surely a creation. And if Jesus Christ is a human being, he is a catesis. Now, of course, they weren't talking about that when they talked about the deity of Christ. They weren't talking about the humanity of Christ. Though all the debate about his deity was highly relevant, and it would have been irrelevant to have discussed his humanity at that particular point. But once that was affirmed, and it was remembered, of course, that he was no mere God. He was actually man as well. It was almost an embarrassment to take up the topic, and for a number of people, it had already been overcome so that they were believing, the Monophysites were, that he was no longer human. They had solved the problem by his humanity having been taken up in his deity, but for the Orthodox Church in general, that was a false solution. Jesus Christ was and his humanity had to be dealt with. I cited number 3, a contemporary manifestation of the same problem. As one modern heretic put it, in answer to the question, is Jesus Christ God? Of course not. God is God. Now that's pure heresy, as it was mentioned, and it was a great trial. And a man should have been put out of the church, but he wasn't, because of the decadence of the church in our time. But at the same time, you can see a kind of rationality in it. He's asked, is Jesus Christ God? And of course, he's thinking of Jesus, who lived in Palestine, died on a cross, and so on. And of course, he said, of course not. God is God. It's pure heresy to deny the deity of Christ, but it seems like pure rationality to say, when asked, is Jesus Christ God? Of course not. Jesus Christ is a man. Man is not God. God is God. Now, that which was absolute heresy sounded like pure rationality. The problem is, how could Jesus be God and man? Well, the sense in which he was God, he wasn't man. The sense in which he was man, he was not God. His humanity is not deity. His deity is not humanity. That's perfectly true. But the combination was there. One of the controversies that developed during this whole period of discussing the humanity of Christ in relation to the deity of Christ had to do with this particular term. One group of Christians were insisting that the child Mary carried was divine, and they used the language theotokos. She was the God-bearer. The other group, the Antiochian group, insisted she was Christotokos. She was the bearer of Christ. You see, in a certain sense, that's an ancient anticipation of the question I was referring to that was brought up in our time. The Orthodox Church was saying that that human baby in Mary's womb was no mere human baby. That human baby was in hypostatic union with the second person of the Godhead. There was no separation between the divine Christ and the fetal Christ. The others, by saying Mary was Christotokos, the bearer of Christ, was speaking sober truth, of course. She was bearing Christ. What could be wrong with that? But here again is an interesting thing that you must notice in the history of controversies, especially Christian controversy. Terms which in themselves are not wrong or evil or heretical, in a certain context actually are so. This, as a statement that Mary was Christotokos, was utterly true. But this as a statement didn't mean merely that. It meant that Mary was Christotokos. She was not Theotokos. She was not the bearer of Christ, and that is heresy. Because when the second person of the Godhead took upon himself human nature, he did it in the virgin's womb. And the child Mary carried was a human child, but who was not a mere human child. But that created a major controversy. Here again, I like that term, a book entitled Creative Controversies. Controversies are terrible things. Awful spirits are often raised by them, and terrible things are frequently done in the heat of them, and frequently controverting the very nature of Christ. You see very, very unchristian attitudes displayed, but at the same time, if you follow the nature of a controversy, many of them are profoundly creative. Certainly the controversy concerning the deity of Jesus Christ, a bitter and a centuries-long fought-out one with a great deal of evil wrapped into it, was the greatest creative controversy the world has ever known. And that it would come about without the controversy, I doubt very much. And so a controversy here, but a very, very, very important controversy. Stated, nevertheless, in just one word. As I say, here's the difference between the word Christos and here's the word theos. Over here it was just, remember, versus oi. Battle over a diphthong, where he was of the same essence, you remember, and of like essence. How could it get any finer than that? No difference except in the iota. And yet all the difference between an infinite being and a finite being. But what we're dealing with now is whether Jesus Christ, who has been clearly, emphatically, gloriously affirmed to be very God of very God, is also a man. And whether we can actually face that fact. There's a sense in which as God he's not man, as man he's not God, but can you say about Jesus Christ he's not God? Can you say about the divine Christ he's not man? That is what's being fought out and settled creedally and officially, in a certain sense, for the whole church in the 5th century, especially in the East. Number 4, there were also those in the 4th century who could not see that if Christ was God, he could be man, the Monophysites. Or if he were man, he could be God, the Nestorians. See, these differences that you see built into the grammar of the situation are represented by champions of it. Here are the Monophysites, these one physis, one nature, namely a divine nature, Monophysites. They say, if Jesus Christ is God, they were orthodox, very, very orthodox. No Arianism there. No. This Jesus Christ is the eternal Son of God, eternally begotten, very God, of very God. But precisely for that reason, utterly unthinkable that the human nature could have existed so as to have Christ to be diophysite. No. He has to be mono. Now, he did take human nature upon himself through the Virgin Mary, but the human nature in the presence of the divine couldn't possibly continue to exist. It was taken up into. And they could live with the idea of a divine Christ who once had been human, and because humanity couldn't exist in their thinking alongside of the divine nature, the human nature was indeed taken up into the divine. Now, on the other hand, were the ones who had the problem in the other direction, the Nestorians. It just came from Nestor. They don't have a Greek significance in the word itself the way Monophysite does. But the Nestorians were maintaining that if Jesus Christ was a divine person, all right, they agreed with that. But if he was really a human being, he had to have a human person also. He had to be a human personality as well as a divine personality. So what you have here, you see, is a di-personality, a dual personality, which is as heretical on the other side as the monophysis, or the one nature, on the other. Now what Chalcedon, I'll read a little later, what Chalcedon is going to say is that Jesus Christ is a divine person. You're both right on that. But with one divine nature, one divine person with two natures, divine and human. You could see the pressure there. Impossible. The Monophysites were saying two natures. There can't be a human nature alongside of a divine nature. You're wrong, Monophysites. That divine person took upon himself a genuine human nature which was never fused with the divine nature, never taken up into it, always existed. So from all eternity, he's going to be the God-man. A human nature as truly as a divine nature. And they're saying to the Nestorians, his nature as a human being is genuine, but it doesn't constitute a second person alongside his divine personality so that he ends as a kind of split personality or dual personality. This was the achievement of the Council of Chalcedon, A.D. 451. Probably next to Nicaea, the greatest council ever held, and in a certain sense a very great improvement on Nicaea, building on Nicaea, reaffirming the deity of Jesus Christ, but maintaining also that he was one divine person, and against the Monophysites that he permanently, indeed eternally, took upon himself a second nature and a human nature. Number 5, the great council of Chalcedon in 451 did not tell the Monophysites how Christ could be both God and man, but it did tell them in almost inspired language that it was so. See, Chalcedon isn't explaining this to the Monophysites. The Monophysites look as if they have a point here. How can a finite being exist alongside of an infinite being? How can the infinite being actually have a finite being in its very nature? Chalcedon doesn't throw any light on that subject. It doesn't answer any theological difficulties there. It just simply says, this is the case. This is what God has done. He has taken upon himself a human nature that he never does absorb. And they were, of course, arguing all this biblically, you understand, exegetically. They recognized very well that the normativity of these judgments came not from the council, but from the Word of God, and heavy exegetical battles went on there. But all I'm saying at this particular point is, they're saying, I don't know how God can do this. I know he did do it. And everybody's prepared to admit that if God did do it, he could do it. And if the Bible said he did it, he did it. And that was the prevailing judgment of the council. And in a certain sense, they were saying to Nestorius, I don't know how you can have a human nature without a human personality. You've got a point there. It seems almost inevitable. See, both of these arguments seem to be indisputable, right on the surface of it. You can't contest it. Self-evident. If it's a divine nature, there can't be a finite nature alongside of it. If there's a true humanity, how can it exist without a personality? Now, if there's a human personality, then you've got a divine and a human personality. You've got a di-personality. Chalcedon is simply saying, I don't know your answer, but I know this is the truth. I don't know how to explain this, but I know this is what God has revealed. And the church did come to that conclusion. And as I say, I think I make the statement here somewhat that's almost inspired language. If you look at the creeds since Chalcedon, you'll find them almost repeating, as if they can't improve on what's already been said. As far as I know the history of Christological controversy, I don't see a single subsequent development that marks a real improvement on the Chalcedonian definition of the full person of Jesus Christ as divine with two persons. Now, later on, in the later Constantinople synod, they decided that he had only one will also. See, that was debated as well. He had two wills as well, dithelitism. So this was a subdivision of the argument we have here, and you can see how it grows out of the Bible, and Christ saying, not my will, but thy will be done. And there were some people, therefore, who even after Chalcedon was hanging in there for the fact that Christ must have had two wills, but the old monophysitic tendency would reassert itself. It's impossible. He's a divine being. The divine being couldn't tolerate a finite being. Infinite being couldn't have a finite being. And there couldn't be two natures. There certainly couldn't be two wills. How can anything stand against the divine wills? It's monophysitism reaffirming itself in a last-ditch stand against this doctrine that led Constantinople later on to affirm that Jesus Christ was dithelite, as well as having two natures. He had two wills, and you might well say that by that time the full doctrine of the incarnation has been articulated by the creeds of the ancient church. Number 7, Jesus Christ is one God who has two natures, divine and human. 8, these two natures were not so combined that the human nature was absorbed into the divine against the Monophysites. Nor 9, so separated that they became two persons, and Christ a split personality against the Nestorians. From 451 to 1989, the church has not essentially improved on what Chalcedon did for the glory of the incarnate Son of God. I might put as a little footnote here, some of you know about the Chalcedon movement in our time, the Chalcedon report associated with Rushdoony and others, but he's the father of the movement, Russus John Rushdoony. You can see where the name theonomy and reconstruction comes, but you might wonder where they get the name Chalcedon, or call themselves a Chalcedonian movement and write Chalcedonian reports and records and such things as that. Well, it's an interesting little detail here. Rushdoony is of Armenian, not Arminian, but Armenian ancestry. And the Armenian church very early went off into heresy with respect to the person of Christ. And Gerstner wants to remind the world that his family and he, though Armenian, are nevertheless orthodox about the person of Christ. See, later Protestant missions in Armenia did bring a sounder Christological view than early Armenia had adopted. And Gerstner, when he calls his movement the Chalcedonian movement, was wanting the world to know that though he was Armenian, he was not heretical, but was actually Chalcedonian. It's a shorthand way of saying that he and his movement believe that Jesus Christ is very God of very God, but that he has two natures, not just one, and only one person, and not actually two. This movement is a relatively small movement, but it's very powerful. Some of you may have seen it on TV being analyzed by one of our interpretive reporters a few months ago, and it's being radicalized by some and felt to be hopelessly anachronistic and wanting to reenact all the Old Testament laws, political and social, as well as moral. And all of those things may be true about the movement, and they may be the most conspicuous part about the movement, but it's good to realize that this movement, of which Gerstner is still, I suppose, the at least head and major influence, is core orthodox, and it does rest on the classic position of the early church. Now, let me just say this in conclusion. Before in the next lecture, we're going to address a notable deficiency in this early church development. But remember, we are now still into the 4th century. We are in 5th century. We are in the period when the Eastern church predominates, both in influence and also in numbers. The church is moving out from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. It's penetrated Rome, and it's gone as far as Britain and so on, and is widespread in North Africa. But at the same time, its center of gravity is still in the east, and there are 4 metropolitanates now there, whereas only Rome in the west is so. Augustine's going to come on the scene, and we're going to be considering him in the next lecture, and we're going to be seeing in him a development of orthodoxy that is conspicuously lacking in the early church. But before we say goodbye to the early church in the East, I just want to leave this reminder with you that we owe to the early church to this day the finest development of Christological orthodoxy the church has ever seen. It's almost made it unnecessary for greater development in the West. Augustine and the others, believing as Nicaea and Chalcedon had maintained, were able to fill out the lacunae in Eastern Orthodoxy, the conspicuously absent features of the biblical message that they had not been able to develop because they were so preoccupied with the very center of the gospel, namely the person of Jesus Christ. But let me say, as we say a sort of tentative goodbye, not a permanent goodbye, because the church still exists in the East, and it's still operative, and though it's much weaker now than it was then, it's still a witness to Christianity, that we owe to the Eastern Church a permanent obligation of having, for all time, as it were, given us a picture of a true and sound and biblical view of our Lord Jesus Christ.